Okay, that's coming up. I think you're still too spread out. Can you move your group down? Ladies down this way. And then you guys squeeze this way. You guys are okay. It just seemed very impersonal to then. Okay, so two things, and this is kind of choose your own adventure that we can do. So I did prepare for this class, this presentation called The Catacombs, the Big Screen, and Everything in Between. And not actually everything, but it made a good title. And so really what this is about is kind of tracking the history of visual arts in Christianity, starting with the catacombs, and then how that eventually morphs into cinema, okay? So that's one option that we have before us. The other one is if for some reason you just have like pressing questions about technology in the arts and you're like, boy, I wish he would talk about this rather than that, I'm willing to do that as well. So give me some feedback here. What's your choice? What would you like? Or we could do a combination of both. I just work through the catacombs and the big screen, and you have permission to interrupt me at any time and ask questions, and we can divert. Does that sound good? I'm trying to read you. I can't read minds. Okay, all right. So let's do that then. Let me grab one more thing. There was a music stand here before that disappeared, and I just want to get some notes. Notes are helpful for me because I can talk nonstop without notes. So notes are a way to be a bridle for me. And, oh, is it? I don't know. It disappeared. I think someone else needed it, and that's okay. I can function without it, but I am going to find my notes. And I came loaded with tons of notes because I'm preparing a sermon for Sunday and a school of ministry class on another day. Well, you know what? Here we go. That's what I was looking for. Okay, so the catacombs, the big screen, and a few things in between. And some of this, I'm going to skip through pretty quick because I've already given you part of this introduction about artistry in the Bible. And so there is a lot of artistry in the Bible that we see that God shines his face upon. And we talked about also the creativity of man, that this is part of kind of what makes us in the image of God, that we're not content just to, and I don't think God intended us to be content just with, he presented us a world with a lot of wonderful things, but it seems that God worked in our hearts this desire to take the things that he gave us and to produce things, to develop. It begins with gardening, but it doesn't stop there, as we looked at Genesis, where the creation of tents and then instruments and metalwork, all of those things. And also, we looked at the subject of Bezalel earlier this week, who God had put his spirit in them, gave them understanding to do certain crafts. And not only that, but put in his heart the ability to teach. And then this morning, we talked about this problem of idolatry, when man turns his back on God and he begins to serve the creature rather than the creator. And a great example of this is a story that comes in the book of Numbers, where the people are complaining, and God sends these fiery serpents, and they begin to bite people, and people begin to die. And Moses intercedes for them, and God tells them, I want you to make a bronze serpent on a pole, and anybody who looks at that will be healed. Of course, this is a picture of Christ and the cross, and Jesus actually used this story to point to himself. But what's interesting is what happened to this piece of this craft. This had to be crafted, a pole with a serpent on it. Well, it's interesting. In 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 4, this was at a time when one of the kings of Israel were cleaning house, and it says he removed the high places. This was King Hezekiah. He removed the high places, broke the sacred pillars, cut down the wooden image, and broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made. For until those days, the children of Israel burned incense to it and called it Nehushtan, which just means like a piece of metal or a piece of brass or bronze. It's just a piece of metal. And yet, it had stuck around for a long time. This was like 700 to 800 years after it had been crafted, and it's still around So this is where, once again, the arts and technology can get out of hand and become idolatry. Now, let's talk about early Christianity and where we see Christians expressing their faith through art. And we find this in the catacombs. And Alvin J. Schmidt, in a book called How Christianity Changed the World, he says during the first 3 centuries, early Christians contributed very little to the world of art. So we don't have many examples in the first 3 centuries of Christians producing any art. And he says, given that art flourishes best in the context of freedom, and he goes on to say, which the early Christians did not have. This is not surprising. When people are harassed, imprisoned, and even killed for their beliefs, as were many of the early followers of Christ, there's neither opportunity nor energy left for art. Yet, in spite of the persecution, some drawings and frescoes were produced, most of these done in the catacombs near Rome. Now, Catacombs 101. You've probably heard of the catacombs. Okay, so not a lot of people understand the catacombs. So just a basic understanding is that Christians in the first several centuries, under the rule of Rome, under a Roman Empire, were not allowed to. In fact, it wasn't just for Christians, it was other groups as well. You couldn't really own buildings or have private, what they would call clubs, to meet with any kind of organized group. It was just forbidden. They were afraid that those would cultivate things that would upset the empire, upset the kingdom. So they were tolerant of burial practices. They felt like death and burial was somewhat sacred for everyone, and so they allowed what they called burial societies. They didn't allow other societies, but you could have a burial society. That means you could group together and say, we're going to be a group, and we're a society that buries our dead in such a place. So they were allowed to actually own burial property. And that's where the catacombs. So the Christians were very thoughtful, and they said, okay, we have to bury our dead anyway. And since it's allowed, let's start building. And the Christians built a massive network of these catacombs underground, and they're vast. But one of the things is that they also used it for private secret meetings, and that was a bonus. So kind of like having church in a graveyard. But this is what we find, is that the catacombs just kind of became a small oasis of freedom for Christians. And once again, art flourishes best in the context of freedom. They didn't have a lot of freedom, but in the catacombs, they had a little. And so it shouldn't surprise us that in the catacombs, we see what were Christians doing with the little bit of freedom that they had. They were actually producing some art. So here are some examples of what kind of art, what kind of drawings have been found. Well, they're oftentimes depictions of biblical accounts. So this is a picture of the healing of the woman who touched the hem of Jesus' robe. Here's another account of what they believe to be the Last Supper. There are also in the catacombs drawings of symbols of Christ. So here's one, the Good Shepherd with the sheep. So they're so symbols, and that's a pretty elaborate symbol, but they even got more basic. So Christian symbols like what they call the ichthus, or the fish. Ichthus is the Greek word for fish, and it formed an acrostic for Jesus Christ, God's Son, Savior. So this is just kind of an early Christian symbol, as well as you see a cross there. You can see several symbols, but they're all kind of pointing to early Christianity. There's some other, once again, some symbols, some cross-type symbols, some fish, a fish symbol. And then there are also like olive trees, doves, and then there are more biblical depictions. In the case of here, this is not actually sure what this one is, but guess we could spend some time trying to analyze it. But then this is the three men in the fiery furnace, so some Old Testament as well as New Testament. Here is somebody preaching, and you see the symbol of a dove, so representing the Holy Spirit. And you can kind of see a pulpit and an audience. There's this next one, I believe, is believed to be a depiction of the Apostle Paul. So we don't know whether it is or not, but there's all sorts of, they do all sorts of guessing. Here's just another picture of just a part of the catacombs where you see lots of these pictures all together. So they didn't just make the pictures, they actually decorated the catacombs. So they used artistry to just paint things that made it more pleasant and interesting when you're underground, under the earth. How can we, and then you got to imagine that this is obviously being lit by artificial light for the picture. It would have been illuminated by lamps, so a little bit warmer lighting. Okay, so we're going to make a big leap right now for the sake of time, because from the time of the catacombs we're going to jump to the 1600s. And during that time we could talk a lot about the artistry that came through the church, which comprised of not only painting, drawing, painting, sculpture, also music, music production. A lot of things did happen during that season of freedom in the church. But I wanted to just show early stuff. So from the earliest time of the church, we've had, these are better than doodles, but basically the church was like, we've got some time, what are we going to do with that time? And I do want to say that for those of you who are interested in any kind of production, this is a great time in your life where you have lots of time, maybe too much time. And the thing about any kind of media production, whether you're just drawing a picture or doing a painting, or if you get into digital production, it's going to take time, and you've got that. And someone asked me earlier, because I gave you a little sampling of some of the things I've done over the years, but that's over the course of 30 plus years. But one thing I've learned is that if you consistently do something, even if it's over a longer period of time, you actually produce things. And those things are useful, can be useful in the church, can be beneficial to other people. But if you don't take the time to do it, it never gets done. Wishful thinking is not enough. You actually have to put pen to the paper. You actually have to set out to set some goals, figure it out, and begin your production. So we are going to do a big time leap from the time of the catacombs. As I said, we weren't going to follow everything in between. And we're going to get to the 1600s because I want to bring us into, where do we get from simple drawings in the catacombs to filmmaking in the 21st century? Well, it begins with something called the magic lantern, which is actually the earliest type of image projector. So we're using image projectors. These are I don't think they're probably LED, but there's some sort of light source, and we're sending a signal to that, and it's projecting light, RBG, so red, blue, and green, and in little points, and it comes together and it makes an image. Well, this technology that we're using today was being used in from the 1600s to the 1800s. So here's a picture of a magic lantern, and it was before the days of electricity. You see some smoke coming out of that because actually they used a lamp like a fire to kind of provide the light. And then let me just see here. Okay, so you see a little smoke coming out here. But here, I want you to and you see a lens. So this would have been an optical lens. So, and then a light source. So you have a light source back here. It's venting. But this right here is very important. This is a slide. And so we use, even today, your team back here, your AV team, will still refer to anything they're putting, still images that they're putting up through a projector are still referred to as slides today. And like a lot of people don't even know, why do we call it a slide? Well, because in the days of the magic lantern, this was a piece of glass with an image painted on it. And that glass, and you had multiple ones of these, so you would slide it in front of the light source, and you would slide it out, and you would slide another piece of glass in, and you would slide the other piece of glass out. So that's where we get the term slide, even though technically nothing's sliding anymore. But originally it did. Here's another example of a magic lantern, just kind of built into a building. So this wouldn't be a portable. This would be almost like a theater where you have a light source, and this is kind of, I don't know if we can we cut these lights here? Are they, there we go. Okay, so you have and these were used for entertainment purposes. That looks like death there, like a skeleton with a sickle. So that doesn't look real pleasant. But you can see the slide here with multiple images. So they would slide it through. You can maybe get 3 images on there. Your lamp is a light source, a lens, and a box. So this is going back to the 1600s. The interesting thing, though, is that Christians adopted this technology and would utilize it for gospel purposes. Here's an actual magic lantern. I've actually seen some of these. I came across one in a resale store or at a flea market or something, and I was almost tempted to buy it, and I'm like, nah, do I really want something like this? Just be for demonstration purposes. I'll just show you a picture. And then you can see down here, also, this would be early animation. Even though it wouldn't be moving animation, it's still sequential. So you have a story being told. A person going to a honey barrel, and then the guy falling into the honey barrel, and someone pulling him out of the honey barrel, and now and this is really comical, this is almost like comics today, and then honey and bees coming around the guy with honey. So you could tell a better story than that, but this is early what we call visual storytelling. You can tell that story just by looking at it, what happens. All right. But as I mentioned, Christians began to adopt this. So Livingston, the missionary, also employed this. This is a slide showing Livingston's own story, but he himself used the magic lantern on the mission field to tell Bible stories. And so now it got a little bit more. So David Livingston, he was in Africa. Then there's something called the stereopticon. That was the next iteration. And a stereopticon was a magic lantern or a slide projector that had 2 or more lenses. Here's an example of a triple lantern. And the reason they would have these lanterns would be to dissolve between images when projected. So you no longer were stuck with just one image. you could go from one image to a second image and dissolve the one to the other. This is where we get transitions. And we still, so if anybody do editing, so if you've edited at all, you can take either film clips or you can take still images or a film clip and a still image, and you can blend them together, and you do that through what they call a transition. So transitions were birthed through the stereopticon. Another thing that was interesting was that churches used these these magic lanterns to display hymn lyrics with images. So you guys think you're cutting edge, but I'll tell you, this is old technology of taking hymns and making slides with an image. So what you're even using in church today with modern technology goes a couple hundred years back. So it's been done for quite a while. But these were the early steps towards cinema, and these were all important. These steps had to happen before you get film. And that brings us to 1885. A man named Hannibal Goodwin. He was a rector, so he's a it would be kind of like a pastor, sort of like a pastor at an Episcopal church in Newark, New Jersey. And he tinkered with a flexible, transparent film base that allowed successive photographic images to be coiled on one long strip whose original motive was a spiritual one. This is from a book by Terry Lindvall called Sanctuary Cinema. It tells the history of this. So it really was a person in the church who was also kind of inventive. Like, why not? Why shouldn't we be inventors and thinking through and coming up with new ideas? And so he invented celluloid film, which was essential for now going from still images to something that you can run past a light source at a rate which allows each image then to animate, to blend together and give the impression of live action. And so this is another example of his work, his invention that he was working on. So I believe that film, radio, drama, other multimedia arts can be redeemed for the gospel. But embracing any kind of new medium for the purpose of the gospel and to build up I think there's two functions of the arts, and one is, well, maybe three functions. One is just to add beauty to this world. I think that's a good thing. Sometimes we just add beauty because it's how God has made us. Another purpose is to build the church up. So there are things that we can do that just strengthen and build up the church. And I believe that there are things that we can do that can be outreach, that can go out to the world. And so all of these ways, these new mediums need to be in submission to Christ. And a lot of these inventors were Christians, and their heart was, I want to use this for good purposes. Now, it didn't stop people who were not Christian from taking these technologies and then using them for selfish reasons or worldly purposes, but it shouldn't stop the church. Now, it's interesting that as we get a little bit closer to talking about film, as I think about my childhood, and I don't know how it would relate to yours, a lot has changed since I was a child, but the first movie that I saw in the theater at 5 years old that my parents took me to was a kind of a cutting-edge science fiction film by a guy named George Lucas called Star Wars. So it was released in 1977. I was 5 years old, and that was my first film that I saw in the theater. So it was kind of I had no idea that would be viewed as an epic movie moment if you happen to be alive and have seen Star Wars in the theater when it was released, but I did. And it left a deep impression on me and my brothers who that's all we could think and dream of was Star Wars and space and lightsabers and Jedis, and it just became kind of a part of our life. Later on, though, a few years later, I remember another significant cinema moment in my life, which would also leave as deep of an impression on me. And that was our church was hosting a special event, and I don't remember what night of the week it was, but we came to church to watch a movie, which was unheard of, like that just was not a normal, like church for me as a child was something that I thought was pretty boring. And we went because my parents made me go. And in fact, I'll tell you, confessions of we had pews, and church was so boring to me, and if I could doodle, I would doodle, draw, but for the most part, I wasn't allowed to do that. So I learned how to fold up and put my elbows on my knees, put my chin on my hands, kind of create some blinders, and then just go to sleep. I would sleep if I could. I'd go to sleep during church and try to get away with it. That's how enthused I was about church growing up. But that night, I didn't want to go to sleep. And it was quite a moment because it left an indelible impression on my mind. It's stuck in my mind in a good way. And that was even where I was sitting, which was on the right side of the church, about a third of the way back, and further right than center. I remember seeing the projector. So they brought a reel-to-reel projector in and had it set up in the aisle. They put up a portable screen on the platform. And then I don't know what they did for sound, but they obviously figured something out to provide a sound source for the movie. And they put the lights down, and I remember just even seeing that beam of light coming from the projector where you see the dust. And we watched the film The Hiding Place about Corrie ten Boom. And that film was not a Disney film. That film is intense. And I remember there was one scene in that film where a woman is caught stealing or something, and the Nazi soldier takes her up against the wall and puts her hands up against the wall and takes the butt of his rifle and smashes her hands. And I'll never forget that. It was traumatizing to watch that scene. And but look at the power of media. I just told you two stories from two different perspectives, one from Hollywood, and one from that film was produced by Billy Graham, and a film production company that he was starting up and wanting to use film to reach people. And what a powerful story that was. But let me tell you, here's another story. In 1890, a man named W.T. Stead highlighted the need for the church to establish a magic lantern mission. So there were people who were thinking it through and say, hey, let's take this technology and let's just start a mission where we take magic lanterns everywhere and tell gospel stories through them, attracting people. The Salvation Army also had a cinematography outreach called the Limelight Department at the end of the 19th century. Now, I'm trying to find a story here. I'm a little bit out of order, but let me see if I can find it here. Well, I don't know if I included this story. I'll at least put the picture up here. So this is 1887. This is Harvey Henderson Wilcox. I know the story enough to be able to kind of tell it from memory, the basics. He and his wife, they were Christians, and they had a tragic death of their only child. And this left his wife very depressed. And in kind of pursuit of trying to find solace, they discovered this part of Southern California that had a few maybe some, I think they were nut or fruit tree groves, and it was pretty desolate, but it was a very beautiful little valley, and they decided that they wanted to settle there and kind of pour their life into something bigger than themselves after the loss of their child. And so they had a master plan for a little town that they wanted to build, and he got his wife involved, who helped lay out the town. Interesting thing about this town that they wanted to start was because of their Christian faith, they wanted to offer to any church of any denomination a plot to build a church if they would. The town was also going to be free from alcohol, so it was going to be what they call a dry town. And his wife had plans of lining certain streets with holly bushes. So the city was called Hollywood, that they established. And they started this little town of Hollywood. Christians wanting to serve the Lord. So we can see how things can become corrupt. And, Hollywood is not that vision that they had initially. So, as I mentioned, the Salvation Army, so this is the Limelight Department. This was the son of William Booth, who started one of the earliest film companies that existed. So this even predates the secular idea. So this was cutting edge, where they said, hey, let's make films that glorify God. And you notice in this picture here, we see them working with film, but here there's a magic lantern there with 3 lenses. So they were doing whatever they could, and notice here, so they're projecting, they were telling Bible stories. And what you can't imagine is that this was so new, this technology was so unusual, it became a spectacle, and it did attract people. So that's why when you see this depiction here of these crowds, and there's no theater, so they're just projecting it onto a building, put up a sheet and project it, and it would draw and attract people, and they would use this for the gospel. This whole process, by the way, of presenting films in this way are still being used on the mission field. There are still parts of the world that don't really have TVs and theaters. I know in India, they play a film called Man of Mercy, which is a film about the life of Christ, and they still go out into remote villages and hang sheets and take projectors, and they'll take generators to provide power, and for some of these villagers, it's the first time they've ever seen any moving picture. So it's a big deal for them to come see, and it has a deep impact. I remember reading about one of the things that the Salvation Army did to attract people, which wouldn't work today, was they would also go out and just get documentary films of things that people had never seen before. And one example was a hippopotamus. So they'd go like, hey, let's send someone to Africa and take a camera, and let's get some footage of a hippopotamus, because people never seen this before. And then we're going to take that hippopotamus and other interesting things that we've captured on film, and we're going to take them to people and advertise it. Come see a film of a hippopotamus. And that would draw people into seats like, I want to see a hippopotamus. And so that sounds crazy for us today, but back then it was a huge draw. And then they would use, once people are in the seats and they got to see it, then they would use that opportunity and preach the gospel. And so it's great. Now in 1895, the Reverend Robert Pierce wrote a book called Pictured Truth, and he made a defense for Christians being engaged in telling stories through moving pictures. So he was someone who was looking ahead and saying, you know what, I think we really could reach a lot of people if we embrace this and really go into it. So that was another big step. And then 1899, Herbert Booth says, these means are employed by the worldling. They form a source of attraction in the theaters and music halls. Why should they be usurped by the enemy of souls? Back in the 70s, there was a musician, Larry Norman, who had a song called "Why Should the Devil Have All the Good Music?" And so it's kind of that same idea. Why should we let the world just do this without us utilizing these things to put out something that's even better? So here's an example also of a film that was put out by Herbert Booth. So this is the son of William Booth. The Limelight Productions, Soldiers of the Cross, 1900. So they're making Jesus films more than, 124 years ago. They were already doing this. Now, this is going to be seemingly out of order, but film actually predates radio. So it wasn't until 1906 that a man named Reginald Fessenden who had been working with some of the other inventors. He had worked with Thomas Edison, and he was convinced that it would be possible to transmit voice through telegraph and not just the dots and dashes. So telegraph was just a beep, 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 and so, but he's like, but we're sending even a basic beep, an audible signal. He says, I think we can send voice. I think we can do more through the wireless telegraph. And so this culminated on December 24th in 1906 with his experiments with the first radio broadcast in the U.S. Now you have to understand that the only people that would hear this would be wireless operators within range. So if there were wireless operators within range who were normally only hearing beeps, dots and dashes in the form of beeps, for the first time in the world, all of a sudden they would hear, hello, this is Reginald Fessenden, for anybody who can hear me, And what was interesting, since this was December 24th, his first radio broadcast, as people were stunned to hear the voice of a man come over a wireless telegraph, he greeted the unseen audience. He opened his Bible and began to read the story of Christ's birth from the Gospel of Luke. And then he put his violin to his shoulder and began to play O Holy Night while his wife and another friend joined in singing. And that was the first radio broadcast in the U.S., a presentation of the gospel. And in fact, that brings us to an important term, which is the term broadcast. The term comes from radio, sort of. When radio began to really take flight and become a new form of communication, of entertainment, of news, these new radio stations and people producing radio shows, they had to come up with terminology that kind of described what they were doing. So they were the ones who first adopted this idea of wirelessly sending a signal out. We're going to call it broadcast. And it's been adopted by television, so now television broadcast, even YouTube. I don't know if they still have this, but early on in YouTube, their motto was broadcast yourself. So podcast is based on the word broadcast. It's just a little play on words. So this term broadcast goes back to radio, but you have to understand that radio didn't invent the word broadcast. They borrowed the term broadcast from agriculture, because broadcast is a form of seeding a field. So if you're in an agricultural area here, so you probably already knew that. I grew up in agricultural areas, so you have equipment. There's two ways that you can plant seeds. You can plant them individually, and there's equipment today that do that. That's when they're planting corn in rows, they're drilling it in. It's just planting individual seeds in nice and neat rows. And you could do that by hand, or when you're gardening, you're planting by hand. If you're going out and you're seeding, let's say a lawn, or a big field, you would broadcast that seed. And that's the way they've done it for centuries. Agriculture has broadcast seed. And so we have a picture here of early broadcasters. This is one example of many of how they would do this: a basket of seed, walking across a field and just flinging it out. Well, who else talked about this? Jesus talked about this. Jesus gave us a parable. He says a sower goes out and sows his seed. He was talking about broadcasting it, and some falls over here and some falls over there, and you don't really know where it falls. Well, that's the very reason why radio adopted this term because there was no possible way when you send out a wireless signal in those days, a radio signal, there was no way to know if anyone was listening to it. Now today with podcasts, especially in the internet, now all of that can be tracked. But back then, they couldn't know. There's just no way of knowing. They eventually learned ways of like advertising and getting people to respond to a special advertisement so they could sort of track and get a sampling of like, is anybody even listening? But really it goes back, and Jesus was an advocate for broadcasting the gospel. We need to just cast it out there, and we don't always know where it's going to land. We don't know, but as long as the seed is good, we're hoping as we cast it out there for it to land on some good soil. And so today, you have opportunities to broadcast in so many ways that you really ought to utilize, whether it's a blog or whether it's a podcast, or I was talking with someone earlier about animation or making a short film or whatever it may be. If you're figuring out a way to creatively embed the gospel and point people to Jesus, even in simple ways, you can have this wonderful opportunity in the 21st century using these digital tools from your own bedroom or from your home to create things that then broadcast out to the world. And now all the middlemen have been cut out of the picture. You don't have to have a studio release your stuff. You can put it up on YouTube. You can put it up on other platforms. You can find ways to just broadcast it out. An interesting story was there was a film that was submitted to our festival several years ago, and it was submitted in the feature film category. Feature films in our book are anything that's over a half hour long and up, and this film was about 45 minutes long. And it was a story about a group of teenage girls who began to realize that through their use of phones that they were becoming distracted from their relationship with each other and distracted in life. So they decide that they're going to go on a fast, a media fast. So that definitely caught my attention. I'm like, hey, I like this movie, I like this story. And it was well told. It was a well-told story. It caught my attention, and it won some awards at our festival. It was interesting because when I looked at the registration of the film, I realized it was a unique film in the fact that it was a young filmmaker. It was made by a 15-year-old. And that film competed with other films being submitted to our festival by more veteran filmmakers. And the girl who made this film wasn't able to come to the festival, but she won several awards. And after the festival, I reached out to her. And she's in the state of Washington, lives off of an island off the state of Washington. And she had just taken a course, an online course on filmmaking. And with some help with some friends and her mom, they went out and made this movie. And she went on to make a second feature film. And when I talked to her, I said, so what are your plans with the film? She says, well, I was going to just put it up on YouTube. I said, well, you could do that. No doubt. But I said, do you realize that your film is marketable? And I think distributors would be interested in it, and they can help that film maybe get further than you might be able to get. And she said, oh, I never imagined that would be the case. I said, no, believe me, I've seen over 1,000 independent Christian films, and I wouldn't tell you that if I didn't believe it. And she says, wow, I wouldn't even know where to start. I said, well, if you'd like some help, I can put you in touch with a couple distributors that I'm aware of and trust, and you never know. You could at least try. And she said, I'd be glad to do that. So I put her in touch with two different distributors of Christian films, and both of them wanted not only the film that she had in our film festival, but the second film that she made. They both wanted to distribute her film. And so then she was in a quandary over which distributor to pick. 15 years old, and already getting films distributed. So, that's a good use of time and of broadcasting. Okay, so this is this was by a man named Herbert Jump. He was also a minister, and he wrote kind of a booklet called The Religious Possibilities of the Motion Picture. So this is, or I guess it was a pamphlet, so it was in 1910. And once again, this would be someone like Philip Telfer today, who's saying, look, I'm trying to get people to think about this and say, why don't we use these things to reach people with the gospel? So he says, for Jump, there was a great hope in the possibility of using motion pictures for the kingdom of God. And in the book pamphlet, he listed 5 ways which the motion picture functions as a religious tool. I won't go through those, but I'm quoting from a history about this. It says, he articulated the vision of a union between the church and moving pictures so effectively that his writings were reprinted in the Motion Picture Story magazine, which was a secular magazine, and cited numerous times in early film periodicals. So at that time, the church was not being ostracized by what was emerging in Hollywood and other filmmaking. They just thought, wow, this guy has got some good points to make for the church to be involved in filmmaking. Moody Bible Institute used motion pictures to lure indifferent passerby to a series of open-air meetings in Evanston, Illinois in 1911. So many of you are familiar with Moody. And then in 1913, the Edison Company arranged with the Presbyterian Board of Publications to supply films and projectors to churches. Because churches, there weren't a lot of theaters, but a church was equipped because they had a place for seating. They sometimes had an organ because these were silent films, so you would have to add the music to it. They had some infrastructure that was really good for presenting films. Then in 1919, this was a big year for Christians in film. The Methodist Episcopal Centenary in Columbus, Ohio, constructed a open-air moving picture screen that was 136 feet high and 146 feet wide, and a custom high-powered lantern was set up to project the pictures. They had to use such a hot light source that they were having problems with it starting fires. But they showcased not only Christian content, but recent Hollywood and New York silent films, but also amateur missionary pictures and thousands of glass lantern slides to just kind of demonstrate this is what the church could be doing on a global level. And the focus, this event had more than 1 million people in attendance, and the focus was world missions. Now in 1919 also, there was a film called The Stream of Life, which was directed by Horace Plimpton. This, just if you like the Kendrick Brothers films, gospel-centered films, this would be a version of like early Kendricks, where this is a Christian's like, yeah, we're going to use film, and we're just going to tell a gospel story of someone who gets saved and their life is transformed, and we're just going to put it out on screen. What's interesting is that it was 90 minutes long. It took 7 reels. It had subtitles because they were silent films, and it was successful in religious and secular settings. And one example is that it played for free at the Casino Theater on Broadway in New York every day during Easter week at noontime to a packed-out theater holding 2,000 people every day. And the following is an excerpt from a reviewer that wrote this for a newspaper. So a newspaper, they sent in a reporter to give us a report of what's happening at this film. So he writes, as the last scene faded out, the lights were turned on, and a minister stepped quickly to the platform and with uplifted hands said, just a minute, boys, before you go. In the last hour and a half, you fellows have had to take stock of your spiritual possessions. And a lot of you are short, and you know it. How many of you feel that you would like to have someone pray for you before you leave the house? Instantly, without a moment's hesitation, 800 men raised their hands. That's tremendous. What a tremendous impact. This is 1919. So keeping, once again, keeping perspective here is that all of this needs to be through the work of the Holy Spirit working in your life and finding ways, how can we glorify God? I know we're running out of time here, so let me see if there's anything else. Let me just fast forward to the modern era. So it was not until 1953, by the way, Christians actually dropped out of film production for many years because of two things. One was the Great Depression that hit our country in the 20s. No longer could that, it's like you have to focus on the needs of the poor rather than making films. And that was an important step, and I applaud the church for prioritizing. The other thing that affected churches involved in filmmaking was during the era of silent film, the equipment was readily available, pretty cheap, and the church could utilize it. The technology of adding sound to film was so complicated, and by the time it was invented, it was a very difficult thing for inventors to figure out. How do we add synced sound to film? And once that happened, the technology was too expensive and too unreachable for most churches. And so they gravitated towards radio. And churches then focused on we can do radio. And the difference is that silent film, you had to learn to tell visual stories well. Radio, you have to tell audio stories well. And the church got really good at telling stories that involved just communicating like this. But they lost the art of how to tell cinematic stories until Billy Graham started Worldwide Pictures from 1953 to 2003 and began to create films, which I mentioned, The Hiding Place being one of those. But they produced several other films over the years. And then bringing it to, we're running out of time, so if we brought it to there were other little steps along the way, but today, the modern era of filmmaking was really brought about through the Kendrick brothers. So most of these films by Worldwide Pictures were not released in theaters. They were released directly to churches. And there really weren't many examples of films that succeeded in the box office that were made by Christians. So it wasn't until the Kendricks made the movie Facing the Giants that they put it in theaters, and because of some controversy around the film, it got a lot of media attention, and then God used that to propel the film for a successful theatrical release. And so anybody in the industry knows that the modern film era later this month, there's a film coming out called Unsung Hero, about the origin story of For King and Country and Rebecca St. James. It's great. We played it at our festival. We had Rebecca St. James there to introduce it. It was very cool. Had the director and the producer there answering questions afterwards. But, the fact that they have a film in the theaters that you can go and watch everybody knows we have the Kendrick brothers to thank for that. They launched the new era of showing that Christians can, and they were just some brothers from a small little church in Georgia. Well, it's actually a pretty big church, but they from a church in Georgia with a heart to say, let's make a movie. Their first movie, Flywheel, was produced for $20,000. Which may seem like a lot of money, but in the film-making world, that's nothing. And yet God used that. So in closing, I would say, if you're interested in the arts and using technology, there are so many opportunities for you. So there's absolutely zero excuse, because every one of you could start to produce something tomorrow, today. But it begins with having a good idea, working it out on paper first, then putting it into production and finding a way that you're going to get it out to people. But you can you can do it through your local church. A lot of the filmmakers that we respect today all began in their church. The Kendrick brothers were Alex Kendrick, who's more of the filmmaker. His brother Stephen is more of the theologian and preacher. But Alex was part of the AV department at their church. The Irwin brothers, who made Woodlawn and I Can Only Imagine, Jesus Revolution, these are tremendous filmmakers. You know where they began? They were homeschool kids who volunteered at their church in their AV department, right back there. You know, so we might be looking at the next great filmmaker, you know, but that's where they started. They were just serving the local church and being faithful in little things. And little by little, God put them in charge of greater things. So serve where you're at. Start with short projects and make something. Make something. It's so no excuse not to make something. Make sure that it's in alignment with God's word, that it will bring glory to God. But make it, get it out there, and then just keep finding ways to say, God, how can you use my interests to present to the world the gospel through broadcast? Okay, so nobody raised their hands, and I think we're out of time, so we have to but if you have any questions, I'm still around for the rest of the day, and I think we're having a Q&A time tonight as well. But better just one-on-one. So we'll close this and clear out the room for whatever transition. I think you're supposed to meet with your other groups now. So, but thanks for coming today. Come talk to me later if you have questions.